Let me ask you something real. When was the last time you sat in a room by yourself, in complete silence, not scrolling, not talking, not planning, just present with your own breath? Most people can't go 2 minutes without grabbing their phone or turning on some noise. Silence terrifies them. And you know why? Because silence introduces you to yourself. And if you haven't made peace with who you are, that silence starts to feel like a threat. But here's the truth. A woman who learns to sit with herself in silence becomes the most unpredictable force in the room. Not because she wants to control it, not because she needs to prove anything, but because she's not chasing attention. She's not performing to be liked. She's not begging to be understood. She has become the understanding. See, we live in a world that misunderstands silence. We think silence is weakness, that it means we don't know what to say, that we're losing power. But that's not the kind of silence I'm talking about. I'm talking about the silence born from self-mastery, the kind of silence that doesn't scream, but still shifts the entire energy of the room. The silence that comes from no longer needing validation. The silence that arrives when you finally stop explaining your worth. The silence that doesn't come from hiding, but from knowing. Most women are taught from an early age to give, to care, to serve, to explain. You're taught to cushion your boundaries with soft words so you don't seem rude. You're taught to over-explain your emotions so you don't come off dramatic. But what if I told you, your silence is the boundary? What if stillness isn't the absence of power, but the ultimate form of it? When a woman turns inward, when she reclaims her attention from the outside world and anchors it in her own being, people feel it. They might not understand it. They might even misinterpret it. But make no mistake, they feel it. There's a kind of respect that enters the room when a woman is no longer available for emotional chaos. You know, when you stop reacting to every mood swing, when you stop trying to fix everyone around you, when you stop pouring energy into being everything for everyone, you shift the game, you shift the frequency of your life. But that shift begins with a radical question, one that most of us avoid asking. ALD, where is my energy going? Because here's what we forget. Energy is not limitless. Attention is currency. And if you keep spending it on people who don't respect it, don't be surprised when you feel bankrupt. Let's talk neuroscience for a second. There's a principle in neuroscience called Hebb's law. Neurons that fire together wire together. What does that mean? It means what you focus on, you strengthen. So if you're constantly focusing on other people's needs, constantly reacting, constantly giving your energy away, you're literally wiring your brain for over-responsibility, for anxiety, for emotional fatigue. But if you redirect that attention, if you focus on your breath, your thoughts, your needs, you start rewiring your brain for clarity, peace, and presence. I've seen this happen so many times with the women I coach. They say to me, Jay, I feel like I'm losing myself. I'm always adjusting, always reacting, always doing. I can't even hear myself anymore. And I tell them, that's the sign. That's the moment to turn inward. That's when the real work begins. Because the truth is, turning inward isn't easy, especially when you've been conditioned to look outward your whole life. We've been trained to scan the room before we speak, to anticipate people's reactions, to adjust our tone to keep the peace, to make sure everyone else is okay, even when we're falling apart inside. But silence, true grounded silence, doesn't do any of that. It says, I trust myself. I don't need to explain myself. I don't chase, I attract. And what isn't aligned will naturally fall away. And here's the most powerful part. When you begin to focus on yourself, not in selfishness, but in stillness, everything misplaced in your life begins to fall into place. It's not magic. It's alignment. It's the law of inner clarity. The clearer your relationship is with yourself, the clearer your entire life becomes. Because once you are no longer addicted to noise, you start to hear truth again. Once you stop trying to be seen, you realize you've been visible all along. So if you're listening to this and you're exhausted from over-explaining, if you're tired of shrinking your boundaries for the comfort of others, if you're feeling like you've been performing a role instead of living your truth, I want you to remember this. Silence is not the absence of power. It's the presence of awareness. And when a woman becomes aware, truly aware of her energy, her patterns, her breath, she becomes undeniable, not because she's loud, but because she no longer needs to be. So let me ask you again, where is your energy going? And more importantly, are you ready to call it back? Because when you do, when you return to yourself, when you learn to sit in the stillness of your own being, everything around you will begin to shift. Not because you forced it, but because you became it. Now, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and let me know what's one thing you're reclaiming your energy from starting today. If this message resonated with you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing truth. Thank you for choosing yourself. Let's get one thing straight. Your attention is your most valuable currency. And yet, most people are broke, not financially, emotionally. They're constantly drained, burned out, and confused, not because life is too much, but because they've spent all their energy on things that give them nothing back. Tell me this. How many conversations have you walked away from feeling emptier than when you entered? How many times have you explained yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you? How many days have you spent carrying emotions that don't even belong to you? If you're nodding, you're not alone, but you also don't have to stay there. Because here's the truth. Your energy is not infinite. Every time you overgive without boundaries, every time you pour into people who don't pour back, every time you chase peace in places that only give you chaos, you're spending your emotional currency on things that are robbing you. Let's go deeper. We live in a world that demands so much from women. Be nurturing, be kind, be strong but not too strong, be gentle but never too soft, be available but not needy. And somewhere in this madness, we forget that focus is a form of love, and the first person you need to give that love to is yourself. Not in a self-indulgent way, not in a spa day kind of way, but in a soul first, truth first, life is too short to waste kind of way. Because the more you give without clarity, the less of yourself remains. There's a woman I once met named Mina. She was in her late 52nd. Her entire life had been about showing up for others. Mother, wife, daughter, caregiver. She had this quiet strength, but it was buried under years of self-forgetting. She had become everyone's compass, but when they no longer needed direction, she was lost. One day, after her children moved out and her caretaking roles ended, she sat in the quiet of her home and felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Silence, and it terrified her because the noise of other people's needs had been her identity. Without it, she had no idea who she was. But then something beautiful happened. She didn't run from the silence. She leaned into it. She started with tiny rituals, 80 morning walks without her phone, journaling without editing herself, adieu, saying no without guilt, no audience, no applause, just presence. And slowly, something shifted. She realized she didn't have to earn peace. She just had to stop giving it away. Her conversations became more intentional, her relationships more reciprocal. She stopped explaining her boundaries and simply started living them. People around her began to respond, not because she changed them, but because she changed her focus. She reclaimed her emotional currency. Let me ask you something that may hit a little too close. What are you still giving your attention to that doesn't feed your peace? Because the moment you start observing instead of reacting, the moment you stop chasing and start choosing, the moment you value your presence as much as you value your performance, that's the moment you begin to reclaim your energy. And I want to be clear, this isn't about shutting people out. It's about letting yourself in. You see, when you've spent your life being everything for everyone, it feels strange, almost wrong to turn that energy inward. You might ask, am I being selfish? Will they think I don't care anymore? Who will I be if I'm not needed? But these are not signs of selfishness. These are signs of awakening, because for the first time, you're realizing that peace is not found in being needed, it's found in being whole. You don't need to abandon others to focus on yourself, but you do need to stop abandoning yourself for others. And here's where the neuroscience backs you up. Remember Hebb's law from earlier? Neurons that fire together, wire together. Every time you obsess over someone else's approval, every time you replay that argument in your head, every time you explain your feelings to someone who refuses to listen, you're reinforcing patterns of emotional depletion. But every time you pause to reflect, to journal, to breathe, you're creating new neural pathways, new default settings for your peace, your clarity, your strength. You're literally rewiring your brain to be centered in truth instead of turbulence. This is not wishful thinking. It's not just good vibes. It's science and it's soul work. So how do you start reclaiming that energy? ALDE. You start by tracking your attention. Ask yourself throughout the day, is this conversation worth my energy? Is this thought making me better or bitter? Is this dynamic draining me or developing me? And most importantly, is this aligned with the woman I'm becoming? Because every time you act out of alignment, you're leaking energy. But every time you choose alignment over approval, you're investing in your transformation. You want to know what's more powerful than getting louder? Getting clearer. You don't need to fight for respect. You need to focus so deeply on your peace that respect becomes inevitable. You don't need to explain why your boundary matters. You just need to honor it silently and consistently. You don't need to be louder to be heard. You need to be anchored to be unshakable. Let me leave you with this. Every moment you reclaim your attention, every breath you take before reacting, every choice you make that reflects your worth rather than your wounds, you are rewriting your life, not for the world, not for their comfort, but for your evolution, because you're not here to be emotionally bankrupt. You're here to be fully resourced, emotionally sovereign, and energetically rich. And the first deposit, it's made the moment you choose you. Most people believe that setting a boundary means you have to give a reason. That to say no with clarity, you must first hand over a justification, something that will make it palatable, something that makes you seem reasonable. But here's what I've learned and what I teach. Self-awareness is the only justification you need. You don't have to be dramatic. You don't have to be defensive. You don't have to justify your healing, because when you're truly self-aware, you stop seeking permission to protect your peace. See, most people aren't afraid of boundaries. They're afraid of being misunderstood for having them. They're afraid someone will think they've changed. Afraid someone will feel rejected. Afraid they'll be seen as selfish, cold, or too much. But here's the truth. Self-awareness is not selfishness, it's self-respect. And boundaries aren't walls to shut people out. They're gates that decide who gets to come in and under what conditions. And let me be clear, when a boundary is rooted in clarity and not in resentment, it doesn't need decoration. It doesn't need softeners. It doesn't need a thesis statement. It just is. Let's go back to the story of Mina, the woman who finally sat in silence after a lifetime of showing up for everyone but herself. Her transformation didn't start with loud declarations. It started with small, quiet acts of self-honoring, morning walks with no digital noise, journaling without editing or censoring, saying no without over-explaining, not because she had something to prove, but because she was done betraying her own needs just to keep the peace. That's when something powerful began to shift. She no longer felt like a supporting character in other people's lives. She became the main character in her own. And when she stopped handing out emotional discounts, people started treating her full price. Here's what I want you to understand. When you truly know yourself, when you know what you value, what drains you, what awakens you, you stop needing validation for your boundaries. You stop shrinking to fit someone else's comfort zone. You stop negotiating your worth for a seat at a table you've outgrown. You simply say, I'm not available for this. And then this is key. You let your silence do the rest. Because sometimes the strongest message you can send is sent without words. Let me pause here and ask you, where are you still explaining yourself in places you no longer belong? Where are you making excuses for your truth? Softening your no, justifying your distance. If you have to keep diluting your boundaries for someone to accept you, ask yourself, are they really accepting you? Or just the version of you that serves their comfort? True connection doesn't require performance. It requires presence. And presence only happens when you stop abandoning yourself for the sake of harmony. Let's talk about Jasmine. She was a professional woman in a 40-second, deeply intuitive, deeply loving, but constantly exhausted. Why? Because she thought every disagreement required a response. Every accusation demanded a defense. Every misunderstanding needed to be cleared up. She'd spend hours trying to be understood by people who were never really listening. She thought being misunderstood meant she failed. Until one day, during a heated argument with her partner, she paused. For the first time, she didn't jump in. She didn't explain. She didn't try to rescue the moment. She simply sat in silence. And that silence said everything. It said, I'm not here to perform emotional labor anymore. I'm not here to be your emotional translator. I'm not here to make myself smaller just so you feel bigger. And what happened next was powerful. The dynamic shifted not overnight, but permanently. It started listening, not because she yelled louder, but because she stopped speaking from desperation. He felt the silence. He felt her peace, and peace is not up for negotiation. Here's what Jasmine taught me and what I now teach others. Silence is not passive, it's presence. When you stop filling the air with explanations, you give people the gift of your clarity. You invite truth to surface because you're no longer drowning in noise. And you allow the relationship to either rise or fall under the weight of its own reality. Either way, you're free. I want you to know this. You are allowed to say no and go. You are allowed to walk away and not explain. You are allowed to change and not apologize for evolving. You don't owe your old self a lifetime contract. You don't owe the people from your past a version of you that no longer exists. And you certainly don't owe access to those who treat your presence like an obligation instead of a privilege. There's a sacred discipline in observing yourself before you respond. Next time you're about to say yes to something, pause. Ask, is this rooted in integrity or in fear? Am I agreeing because I want to or because I'm afraid of what they'll think if I don't? And if you're reacting, pause again. Ask, is this really about what's happening or is this about an old wound being triggered? This space between stimulus and response, that's where transformation lives. Boundaries are not built from bitterness. They are built from clarity, and clarity is built from stillness, from knowing yourself deeply enough to stop defending your value. When you reach that place, you no longer get dragged into every drama. You don't need to be loud to be heard. You don't need to convince anyone to see your worth because your presence says it without a word. Let this land in your heart. A boundary is not rejection. It's redirection toward what aligns with your growth. And sometimes the only explanation you need is your peace, because peace is loud in its own way. It doesn't demand. It doesn't beg. It doesn't chase. It just is. Let me ask you something hard. Who do you become when you're triggered? Do you shut down? Do you raise your voice? Do you send that long message filled with every ounce of pain you've suppressed? And afterward, do you feel more understood or just more exhausted? This is what happens when we live at the mercy of our emotions. We become responders to chaos rather than creators of clarity. But emotional sovereignty, that's a whole different life. Because when you're sovereign over your emotions, you no longer react from wounds. You respond from wisdom. Most of us were never taught how to regulate our emotions. We were taught to either suppress or explode, to calm down when we're upset, or to let it out with no accountability. But both of those extremes are missing the truth. Suppressing emotions disconnects you from your needs. Exploding with emotions disconnects you from your values. And somewhere between that chaos is a space, a sacred pause where you can feel everything without being ruled by anything. That's where sovereignty lives. There's an ancient teaching from the East, control your breath and you control your life. And science now backs this up. Whenever you feel triggered, whether it's anger, rejection, abandonment, disrespect, your brain activates the amygdala, the part responsible for fight or flight. This is the part that says, slam the door, fire back, prove your worth right now. But when you pause, when you breathe just for 5 seconds, you shift from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of your brain where logic, reflection, and long-term clarity live. This isn't spiritual fluff. It's biology. Let me introduce you to a woman named IYA. She was known for her fire, sharp, smart, quick-witted. She didn't let disrespect slide. Every time someone crossed a line, she made sure they knew it. And you know what? She was usually right. But the problem wasn't the argument it was the aftermath. She'd walk away feeling drained, even when she won, because winning the argument came at the cost of her peace. She began to notice a pattern. She was losing more energy reacting to the problem than it would have taken to walk away from it. One day, during a tense moment at work, her colleague publicly dismissed her idea. In the past, she would have snapped back, justified herself, proved him wrong in front of everyone. But this time, she paused, she took a breath. She didn't shrink, but she didn't explode either. She looked him in the eye and said nothing. And in that pause, everything changed. It wasn't empty. It was full of grounded energy, full of inner strength, full of unshakable presence. Because here's what she realized in that moment: the need to prove yourself is often born from the fear of being unseen. But when you truly know your worth, you don't have to perform it. And I want you to hear this. Just because a feeling is loud doesn't mean it's wise. Your emotions are messengers, but they're not always leaders. When you feel triggered, don't just ask, what do I feel? Ask, what is this trying to teach me about me? Is it about this moment, or is it an echo from 10 years ago? Is it about this person, or about the part of you that was never fully heard? Because until you pause to check that, your emotions will keep running your life. To be emotionally sovereign means your internal state is no longer dictated by someone else's choices, tone, mood, or validation. It means you stop outsourcing your peace. You stop being emotionally available to every text, every trigger, every energetic tug of war. And let's be clear, sovereignty is not coldness. It's clarity. You don't become numb. You become disciplined. You don't disconnect. You discern. Every time you react without reflection, you hand your power over. Every impulsive reply, every guilt-based apology, every moment you match someone else's chaos with your own, it's emotional debt. But when you pause, when you breathe, when you step back before you speak, you reclaim authorship over your nervous system. You take the pen back and start writing a different story. This is especially powerful in intimate relationships because, let's be honest, that's where we're most reactive. Why? Because love exposes our deepest fears. Not being chosen, not being safe, not being seen. So we protect ourselves with arguments, or we abandon ourselves by trying to please, but both are rooted in the same wound, fear of not being enough. I remember a woman named Sophia who told me something powerful. She said, Jay, every fight with my partner ends with me yelling, crying, or walking away. I feel unseen, so I get louder. But the louder I get, the more invisible I feel. So we did the work. We didn't try to fix her emotions. We tried to understand them. She started breath work, journaling, sitting with discomfort instead of escaping it. And one day, the pattern broke. During an argument, she noticed her body, tight chest, clenched jaw, shallow breath. And instead of exploding, she said, give me a moment. She walked away not in avoidance, but in realignment. And when she returned, she didn't come back with rage. She came back with truth, not from the storm, but from the center of it. And the result, they actually heard each other, not perfectly, but truthfully. That's sovereignty. So here's the reminder I want to leave with you. You can feel anger and still respond with grace. You can feel pain and still speak with integrity. You can feel triggered and still choose stillness. You are not your emotions. You are the witness of them, the container for them, the transformer of them. Sovereignty is a daily practice. It's the moment you decide not to clap back, the moment you decide not to chase closure, the moment you pause, breathe, and ask, is this response aligned with who I'm becoming? Because once you learn to respond from wisdom instead of wounds, you don't just gain peace, you become it. There's a kind of power that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't walk into a room and demand attention. It doesn't need to raise its voice, prove a point, or perform strength. It just is. It's the kind of presence you feel when a person is fully embodied, calm, anchored, steady, not because they've mastered perfection, but because they've mastered presence. That's embodied stillness. And in a world that rewards noise, hustle, and constant reaction, Stillness becomes a superpower. Let me ask you this. What does your body say when you walk into a room before you ever open your mouth? Because whether you realize it or not, your presence speaks first. Before your words, before your ideas, before your story, your posture, your breath, your eye contact, your tone, all of it transmits your internal reality. And here's the kicker. People don't just hear what you say. They feel who you are. We often think of presence as something mental or spiritual, but true presence is also physical. When your body is not aligned with your emotions, people sense it. You might be saying, I'm fine, but your slouched shoulders say, I don't believe in myself. You might be giving a presentation, but your shaking hands say, I'm terrified of being seen. You might smile politely, but your breath holds the tension of unspoken truth. Say, your body doesn't lie. And when you become aware of it, when you stop ignoring it, numbing it, rushing through it, you begin to reclaim a different kind of power. I once met a woman named Maya, quiet, brilliant, but always overlooked in meetings. She came to me saying, Jay, I know I'm capable, but people don't seem to feel it. My words are right, but my presence, I don't think it lands. So we looked deeper, and what we found was this. Her voice was soft, her eyes often down. Her body language collapsed, inward shoulders hunched, hands clenched in her lap. She was communicating doubt even as she tried to speak truth. And here's what's wild, she wasn't even aware of it. It had become habitual, a silent pattern of shrinking. So we didn't start by fixing her voice. We started by reconnecting her to her body. Every morning, for 5 minutes, she stood barefoot. No phone, no agenda, just breath. Grounding, stillness. She rolled her shoulders back, placed her hands on her heart, felt her feet anchored to the earth, and slowly her energy began to change. Not because she added anything, but because she returned to herself. The next time she spoke at a meeting, something profound happened. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform confidence. She just stood tall, spoke clearly, breathed fully, and people listened, not because she was louder, but because she was finally aligned. That's the power of somatic presence. It's not about performance, it's about integration. When your inner world and outer world match, people trust you more. And more importantly, you trust yourself more. There's a quote I love. The body is not just a vessel, it is a language. And that's true. Your body tells the world what you believe about yourself. If you believe you're unworthy, you walk small. If you believe you're unseen, you shrink your voice. If you believe you need to prove yourself, you rush, push, force. But when you finally start believing you're enough, you slow down, you stand tall, you breathe deeply, because you're not here to chase impact. You're here to embody truth. This is why breath work matters, why posture matters, why stillness matters. Not for Instagram aesthetics, but because these are the tools of presence. When you're triggered, your body collapses into defense mode. When you're grounded, your body opens to awareness. Every deep breath you take sends a message to your nervous system. I am safe. I am here. I don't need to perform to be valuable. That's not fluff. That's neurobiology. And here's the thing. In a world of urgency, a woman who moves slowly, who speaks after thinking, who pauses before reacting, who breathes before deciding, she becomes magnetic. Why? Because people trust what is grounded. There's no desperation in her energy, no chaos in her tone, no emotional manipulation in her silence. Her stillness is not absence, it's precision. And people feel that, let's be honest, most people are used to emotional volatility. They're used to guessing moods, decoding tone, managing triggers. But when your presence is internally consistent, something beautiful happens. Others feel safe around you, not because you cater to them, but because you're not at war with yourself. That's the highest kind of emotional intelligence. You don't just teach it with words. You model it with how you breathe, how you move, how you sit in silence. And this isn't just about work. It's about relationships too. When a mother models somatic presence, her children learn to regulate emotions. When a partner sits calmly through discomfort, they invite vulnerability. When you walk into a conversation anchored and clear, you create a field where truth can survive. This is the kind of leadership the world is starving for. Not loup des voix, not fancier language, but qui était power, embodied power. So if you're asking yourself, how do I become someone who radiates respect without saying a word? The answer is this. Start with your breath, then your posture, then your energy. Ask, what energy am I walking in with today? Is my body mirroring safety or stress? Am I moving from peace or pushing from panic? And the more you check in, the more natural it becomes. This is what emotional alignment feels like. It's not rigid. It's not passive. It's not robotic. It's alive, rooted, and fully present. Let me leave you with this. Your presence is your power. And that power doesn't need performance. It needs embodiment. Because when you walk into a room fully aligned, you don't need to convince anyone of your worth. They feel it because you feel it. And from that place, you don't just speak truth, you become it. There's a universal law I wish more people understood. Your outer world is a mirror of your inner world. The relationships you attract, the opportunities you miss, the chaos you keep finding yourself in, none of it is random. It's all reflecting something deeper, something within. And until you address what's happening inside, the world will keep handing you lessons outside, not as punishment, but as invitation. Let me ask you this. What if the people who frustrate you the most are showing you the parts of yourself still unhealed? I know that's not easy to hear. It's way more comfortable to blame than to reflect. It's easier to point the finger than to hold the mirror. But the truth is, life will keep showing you who you are through who you allow, who you chase, and who you keep trying to change. I once met a woman named Amira, beautiful soul, intelligent, empathic, but stuck in a cycle of on-again, off-again relationships that drained her. Every man she dated seemed great at first, charming, romantic, full of potential. But a few months in, the same patterns emerged. Disrespect, emotional unavailability, hot and cold behavior. At first, she thought, maybe I'm just unlucky. Then she thought, maybe I'm the problem. But neither of those gave her peace because deep down, she knew something else was going on. So she finally asked a more honest question. What is my energy saying before my words do? What beliefs am I carrying that keep inviting the same pain? And what she uncovered changed everything. Amira realized that for most of her life, she believed love had to be earned, that her worth was transactional, that if she overgave, over-explained, over-accommodated, maybe someone would finally stay. So even when her words said, I'm confident, her energy whispered, please choose me. That whisper was subtle, but the world heard it. And when she stopped trying to fix people and started healing herself, when she focused on alignment instead of approval, everything changed. She didn't just change her relationships. She changed what she was available for. That's the mirror effect. The mirror effect says the world reflects your inner frequency back to you. If you carry unresolved grief, you attract emotionally distant people. If you live in self-doubt, others test your boundaries. If you fear abandonment, you cling to those who leave. But when you cultivate inner peace, you stop needing outer validation. And that shift changes everything. This is not about blame. This is about power. You're not the problem. You're the pattern breaker. But you can't break a pattern you won't look at. You can't transform what you refuse to acknowledge. And that's why this work, this journey inward isn't just a nice idea. It's the foundation for a new reality. Let me ask you another question. What if the silence you keep sitting in isn't empty, but is the space where truth finally echoes back to you? When you stop chasing clarity in other people, when you stop outsourcing your intuition to external voices, you create the space for something sacred, self-recognition. The moment you say, I no longer need to be chosen, I choose myself. I no longer need to be understood. I understand myself. That's when life stops mirroring your wounds and starts reflecting your worth. This is why strategic withdrawal is powerful, not to punish, not to play games, but to realign. When you stop feeding a dynamic, you expose its truth. When you stop explaining yourself, you discover who actually wants to understand you. When you stop initiating, you see who values the connection enough to meet you halfway. This is the silence that filters noise. This is the distance that creates clarity. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say nothing at all and watch what happens. There's a story I'll never forget. A woman, let's call her Sophia, had spent years in a relationship that constantly cycled between connection and confusion. She tried everything: long talks, heartfelt letters, compromises, but nothing ever stuck. Nothing truly shifted. Until one day, she didn't argue. She didn't beg. She didn't threaten. She just became silent, not in anger, not in manipulation, but in wisdom. That silence became her boundary. And in that space, the truth of the relationship became undeniable, not because he changed, but because she did. Here's what I want you to hear. When you shift your inner energy, your outer experience can no longer stay the same. People either rise to meet you or they fall away. And both outcomes are a blessing, because when your internal frequency upgrades, anything that's out of alignment will naturally fall off, not by force, but by resonance. This is why inner work is not optional. You don't get the life you want just by visualizing it. You get it by vibrating at its level, by becoming the kind of person who no longer tolerates what your unhealed self once begged for, by becoming the kind of person who doesn't chase love but embodies it. And once that happens, everything around you reorganizes, not because the world changed, but because you did. So if you keep finding yourself in the same chaos, the same relationships, the same patterns, pause and ask, what is this situation reflecting back to me? What story am I still living out? What version of me is still looking for healing through others? Because the mirror never lies, but it will keep repeating until you finally look. Let me leave you with this. You don't attract what you say you want. You attract what you believe you deserve. And the moment you raise that belief, the moment your inner alignment becomes your compass, you become unavailable for anything less than what honors your soul, not because you said it, but because you are it. That's the power of the mirror. It reflects not who you pretend to be, but who you actually are. And when you finally choose truth, stillness, and alignment within, the whole world begins to reflect it back. Let me ask you something honest. Have you ever walked into a room and felt someone's energy before they said a word? Not because they were loud, not because they demanded attention, but because their presence was undeniable. That's the kind of woman I want to talk about right now. The woman who no longer begs to be seen, the woman who no longer explains herself to be accepted, the woman who no longer fights for her value because her energy speaks it before her voice ever does. This is not the woman who tries to be magnetic. This is the woman who has become magnetic. And the secret, it's not in how much she does, it's in how little she chases. Because when you stop giving everything your energy, when you stop showing up for what drains you, when you stop bending for validation, you rise. Your stillness becomes your filter. Your silence becomes your amplifier. And everything that once confused you begins to sort itself out, not because you fixed it, but because you stopped feeding it. We've been taught that magnetism is about effort, that to attract someone's respect, you have to prove you're worthy of it. That to keep someone's love, you have to overextend, overgive, overperform. But that's not magnetism. That's emotional labor disguised as love. Real magnetism isn't about being available to everyone. It's about being aligned with yourself. Because here's what no one tells you. You're the most magnetic when you're the most consistent with your own peace. There's a concept I call strategic silence. It's not ghosting. It's not avoidance. It's not playing games. It's the conscious decision to pull your energy back, not to punish someone, but to protect yourself. It's what happens when a woman realizes my energy is sacred and I don't spend it on places that can't hold it. This kind of silence isn't empty. It's full of discernment, full of groundedness, full of quiet truth. And when you embody that kind of silence, people notice because you no longer speak to prove. You speak when it's true, and when it's not true, you let your stillness speak instead. I've watched countless women evolve through this journey, and the moment the silence becomes intentional, everything changes. It's not dramatic, it's not loud, but it is final. You don't chase the conversation, you don't defend your boundary, you don't circle back to be understood. You allow space to do what arguments never could: reveal the truth. And it always does. Because when you stop interrupting dysfunction with your effort, it either crumbles or corrects itself. That's magnetic power. But this isn't just about walking away. It's about what you walk toward. You walk toward deeper alignment. You walk toward your breath. You walk toward clarity that isn't conditional on who agrees with you. And from that place, you begin to radiate, not for attention, but because you've become light. Let me tell you about a woman I deeply respect. Her name was never loud in the room. She didn't dominate conversations. She didn't chase applause. But when she spoke, everyone leaned in. When she moved, it was with intention. And when she withdrew, you felt it. Not because she disappeared, but because her presence had become a gift, and once it left the room, the energy shifted. That's the kind of woman silence creates. The kind who doesn't need to explain her absence, because her energy already taught you how to respect it. Here's the truth. You don't need to convince anyone you're valuable. You just need to stop betraying your value for temporary closeness. Because every time you over-explain to be chosen, every time you break your boundary to avoid being alone, every time you silence your truth to make others comfortable, you dim your own light. And eventually, the world mirrors that back to you. But when you choose to stay rooted in your values, even in silence, you become untouchable, not because you've closed yourself off, but because you finally come home to yourself. This is what emotional maturity looks like: saying no without guilt, walking away without closure, protecting your peace without needing permission, allowing people to misunderstand you, and letting it be because your energy no longer bends for approval. It aligns with purpose. So let me ask you, are you still trying to be understood by people who are never listening? Are you still speaking truth in places that only respond to performance? If so, your silence isn't the problem. It might be your answer. It might be the clearest reflection of your evolution. Because when you stop trying to force understanding, you make space for truth to arrive naturally. And when people can no longer access you the way they used to, they either rise or they fall. Both are data, both are direction. Let this land. Your silence isn't the absence of voice. It's the presence of power. Your stillness isn't the lack of action. It's the alignment of purpose. And your withdrawal isn't rejection. It's realignment. Because when you stop investing in dysfunction, when you stop fixing what doesn't want to grow, when you stop watering gardens that never bloom, you finally return that energy to yourself. And that energy, that becomes your glow. You want to know what's truly magnetic? A woman who no longer negotiates her standards. A woman who holds her silence, not as punishment, but as presence. A woman who speaks only when it aligns with her peace, her purpose, her power. That's not cold. That's sovereign. And in a world that keeps telling you to be louder, to do more, to explain yourself, your calm becomes your clarity. Your silence becomes your strength. And your stillness becomes your statement. No more chasing. No more proving. No more explaining. Just being. And when you become that woman, the world doesn't just notice, it rearranges to meet you.